engagement here. So welcome in. My name is Jared Morrison. I'm an organization development consultant with the Learning and Organization Development Unit with OSU Extension. And I also have our colleague here, Beth Flynn, from the Department of Agricultural Communication, Education, and Leadership, one of our kind of sister departments in the college. And this has been a wonderful partnership between the two departments with this ACEL 2 extension. It's our third series. We've got 2 more sessions after this, and I think we're raring to go for a 4th series already. The feedback has been great. So we appreciate you all attending, as well as the ACEL faculty putting these on for us. So we appreciate that. I will post the landing page in the chat box right now, which is go.osu.edu/ACEL2extension. That has the recordings from all the previous sessions, as well as registration links for the 2 upcoming sessions in April and May. So be sure to check that out. But we will jump into today. I'm excited to welcome in our presenter this morning, Dr. Caryn Filson. Welcome and thanks for joining us. And she's going to be leading us through learner engagement and has research areas of academic advising, identity development with pre-service teachers, reflection practices and pre-service teachers, and then specialties in helping pre-service teachers become licensed in preparation. So we welcome you in, Caryn, and I'll hand it over to you.
Thank you, Jared. Good morning to everybody. It is great to be with you this morning and to share some time talking about online learner engagement. But before we get started, I am going to ask you to contribute to this conversation this morning right away. In the chat box feature, please introduce yourself to everyone here in the room with us today using 15 words or less. And so I know for some of you, using 15 words and coming up with 15 words might be a challenge. And for others of you, limiting yourself to 15 words could also be a challenge. So I'm going to give you a minute to do that, but please introduce yourself to us and everyone in the room using the chat feature here on Zoom. So go ahead and take a minute to do that for me. I see the introductions coming in. Good morning, Peggy. Good morning, Tracy. Good morning, Megan. And Becky. Good morning, Joy and Carolyn. If you've not submitted your introduction, please make sure you do that here in the next minute. Morning, Summer and Diane, Maria. As the final introductions are being submitted, for everybody else on the chat and on the Zoom with us, take a moment to read through the introductions and see who's in the room with us this morning. Good morning, Don. Good morning, Jen. Jen, I grew up in Butler County 4-H, so glad to see you representing down there in Butler County. And of course, good morning, Jared. So thank you all for engaging with introductions today. I appreciate getting to see who's on the chat and a little bit about who you are and where you're coming from or where you're at today as we go through our conversation about learner engagement. Since you all took the moment to introduce yourself to me, I'll take a quick moment and introduce myself to you as well. And so this will give you some context of where my conversation is coming from and the lens that I'm using today as we talk about engaging learners in online environments. Personally, I am a mom, I am a partner, and I am a farmer. So I currently live in Southeast Fairfield County, and we live on a beef farm and a grain farm with my 2 sons and my stepdaughter. And then professionally, I am a teacher. And so I have been trained in teacher education. I have spent my career as a teacher, whether that was in middle school, adult education, or here at Ohio State in higher education. Here in ACEL, I teach mostly agri-science education courses leading towards teacher licensure, but I also teach a handful of courses in our graduate program, both in person and online. So I've seen some of your names and faces in those classes. Throughout my career, my professional training is within teacher preparation, teaching, and learning. And so when I was thinking about and reflecting, what would I present here in this online environment, talking about engaging online learners, I was kind of torn. Do I use a lot of the new technology that we use to engage learners online? Do I use those fancy applications that we can throw in with tools and video features? Or do I stick to my roots and think about what are the foundations of good teaching and how do we apply those foundations in these online environments? And I started this presentation a few times and I started using the techie side of things and realized, Caryn, that is not your strength. Everybody knows that you are not tech savvy. Stick to what you know. And what I know is the teaching side of things. And so my perspective today as we go through this conversation is how we can engage in good teaching, no matter the environment in which we find ourselves in. So that's the perspective that I'm coming from. And hopefully that gives you a little bit more insight on why I'm sharing the information that I'm choosing to share with you today. So there was a quote during one of my teacher preparation degrees. I think this was my first teacher education degree when I was an undergraduate. And one of my mentors had said a quote, and at the time it stuck with me, but I didn't necessarily understand or resonate exactly what it meant. And my mentor told me, Caryn, good teaching is good teaching, no matter the environment in which you find yourself in. It wasn't until the pandemic started that this quote really resonated and meant something more. When I realized that I had 21 student teachers across the state in 17 different counties that were abruptly taking face-to-face instruction and transitioning it to distance education, we found that those teachers were successful because they stuck to what made teaching good, effective practice. It wasn't the resources that they had. It wasn't the technology that was available to them at their fingertips, because we had teachers that were doing amazing things with little to no technology or internet connection. And we had teachers doing amazing things who had a lot of resources at their fingertips. It boiled down to the good teaching practices came because there were some consistent factors that people were using in order to continue their instruction. That is where I'm going to take this conversation today. I want to have this conversation about looking at those best practices and how we can engage learners in online environments, or we can even take this information and transfer it to a face-to-face or in-person environment and still have good teaching. For those of you like Summer who may come from a teacher preparation program, some of this might sound familiar because we teach courses on this. So I'm going to boil it down to the nuts and bolts so that you can take this information within a 1 hour time frame of when we're going to talk about it and still be able to apply it in your learning environments across the state and in extension offices where you are engaging in learners face-to-face and in online environments. So when we think about the fundamentals of how we engage learners, there were 4 things that I felt were the fundamentals of making sure that your instruction, whether it's in person or online, these fundamentals need to be present if we expect our learners to be engaged. So the 4 fundamentals that we're going to unpack together today would be how to establish relationships, how we create environments that are conducive to learning, how we can engage learners in active learning practices, and how we as educators can provide clear and timely feedback on learning progress. So let's spend time and unpack each of these together. Before I get too far into the weeds and start talking too much here, I will welcome all of you now that we are introduced and have this familiarity with one another. Feel free to ask questions along the way. So if you have a question, feel free to raise your hand using the chat or the reaction feature. I believe we have those available on this call, or you can send something in the chat and Jared and Beth will help me monitor that. But feel free to be interactive through this conversation and ask questions, give insight or seek clarity as you see fit as we continue forward today. So thinking about fundamental number one, and that was establishing relationships. One quote that I like to share with our pre-service teachers is that no significant learning can occur without a significant relationship. What that means is that research literature, over and over again, we have data that supports one of the most important factors in engaging learners is establishing a positive relationship between the instructor, the learner, and the peers that are in the same environment. Once we establish those relationships, we start establishing trust and respect. We start increasing learner motivation. So if somebody has a positive relationship with somebody, internally, they become naturally motivated, or at least more motivated, to want to engage in learning. It creates a sense of belonging when you have a positive relationship with somebody. If you can connect with and relate with the people within the learning environment, you become a part of that learning community. When you feel like you're a part of that learning community, it increases your motivation and engagement to be active in that learning community. As an educator, whether you're a formal educator in a classroom or a non-formal educator out in the field, once we have relationships with our learners, we can make connections between them and the content that we're trying to deliver. So if I recognize that there are some connections between myself and my learners, I can use those connections to really hone in on making that content relevant and applicable specifically to those learners. We don't have that information if we don't have a relationship, because if we don't have a relationship, our learners are not sharing that information with us. So when we boil it down, why, Caryn, do I need to have a relationship with these people who are online, who I may never meet face to face? It's because these factors still apply, and no matter which learning environment you find yourself teaching in, it is still a strong factor to promote learning in any learning environment. Summer, I see your hand raised. Did you have a question?
I do, and maybe you'll get to this in a little bit, but some of the work that I do is designing online courses that are entirely self-paced. And so I'm wondering if you have any tips for being able to help instructors build relationships in online courses when they're not leading the course. They're self-paced, so people are coming in at different times.
I do. You must read my mind. We must be on the same page here, Summer, because I'll slip to the next slide that helps talk about building those connections. When we think about building connections, and I'll start answering that here, Summer, at this slide, and I'll continue because I have a few more slides coming up that will also address that. And then I'll return to make sure that you feel like I've addressed it fully. So when we think about building relationships in any learning environment, but specifically online learning environments, there are two ways of relationships that we need to consider. First, we need to think about student and instructor relationship, as Summer was just asking about. How do I connect with the learners, whether I see them face to face or whether they're on their own in this online environment? The other thing that we need to consider about relationship is peer-to-peer relationship. Again, whether they see themselves and they're in the active environment together, or if then they're this asynchronous environment where they never actually physically talk to one another. The thing about humans is that we're complex and social creatures. So we naturally have these desires and drives to want to connect with other people, even in online environments where we may not see or talk to each other in real time. And so as an educator, we need to think about how we can facilitate and engage these relationships to keep learners as an active part of the learning community. Before I give my 2 cents on Summer's question here and give some suggestions that I have personally used in my instruction, this is where I'm going to give you a moment to do some peer-to-peer engagement. Let's give you 3 minutes. So Jared, if you can set 3 minutes on the breakout rooms. Within the breakout rooms, I want you to have a brainstorm session with one another on how you think we can promote relationships and build these human connections in online learning environments. So perhaps it's something an instructor has done in one of the courses you've taken. Perhaps it's just an idea that is sparking as we're having this conversation. But take 3 minutes in these online environments in the chat room. How can we promote relationships and build human connections in online learning environments. When we return back together, I'm going to ask some of the groups to share their ideas of their brainstorming. Any questions before you get thrown into your chat rooms? If you've not been on a Zoom chat room, you'll see a box that will pop up on your screen. You can go ahead and accept that you'll go into the chat room, and when the timer is up, you will automatically return back here to our main screen. So Jared, I'm good for 3 minutes of brainstorming.
All right, we'll see you in 3 minutes, everybody. All righty. It was pretty quick. Sometimes people can take, you know, almost 30 seconds or so.
To join.
Yeah.
I'm going to pop into a couple of these rooms for a moment.
Okay, great.
I learned something new today, Jared. Thank you about the spotlight.
Oh yeah, yeah, no problem. Yeah, that's I usually like to do it if there's, you know, a big, especially in a big group. I don't know that I've always done it for our sessions. Yeah, but that just makes sure that she shows up for everybody, you know, and that she stays there at the top. Especially because I saw not many of our folks had cameras on, so I figured, you know, we don't need to just stare at a bunch of people's names.
Oh my. But everybody must be participating because they all went to breakout rooms.
Yeah, it looks like it. Yeah.
You know, I stopped going into breakout rooms because every time I come in, I mean, online, because everybody stops talking. At least when you're in person, you can sneak up on them.
Yeah.
From
Yeah.
afar. So
I have kind of noticed, you're right, it's a little more intrusive when they notice, like, what are you doing? Yeah. Yeah, I typically, well, it depends on the time too. I mean, I do, you know, some of our longer programs, if it's like a 15-minute breakout, I'll pop in once just to make sure they're, you know, not sitting there struggling with what to do. But yeah, these quick ones, it's kind of like, you know, even if they sit there for 3 minutes, hopefully they've done something, but
And this is what I love about these online meetings, that we can do breakout rooms so people still get that connection.
Mhm.
And I think that just means so much. And Caryn, I'm just really impressed with you.
Oh, she jumped. She didn't hear you.
Oh.
Because she jumped.
Because I mean, I've never heard somebody explain breakout rooms.
Yeah.
For granted. And I'm like, that's what I wonder if some people just aren't used to it.
Oh, I'm sure. Yeah.
I see, I always learn when I come to these.
Yeah.
From you.
Yeah, we've got some good people, don't we?
Yes, we do.
But that's partially because of your mindset too, right? You learn because you want to learn.
That's true. That 3 minutes went by very quickly.
Yeah. Yeah.
Oh, sorry. I mean,
Quickly for us. We'll have to ask the rest of the folks if it went quickly for them too. All right. Welcome back. I know we've got the majority of folks back.
All right, so I'm going to go ahead and begin the conversation here. So what were some of the ideas? And I popped through a few of the breakout rooms. What were some ideas that were popping up in your conversations of how you could facilitate relationships in online learning environments? And this is the moment where I'm going to ask you to share out loud. I can go ahead and share. I know you popped into our room real quick. In our classes with Snap Ed, when we had to turn, you know, from in-person obviously to online, one of the things we would always try to start a class with, whether it was with kids or with adults, is just kind of those simple, basic get to know you questions of your favorite candy bar, your favorite snack, your favorite movie, your hobby, just something real light and easy that kind of help people feel more comfortable with those light, easy questions. And that way we could move into the more in-depth questions with them. So great example. Thanks, Becky. So thinking about icebreakers, right? That's something we traditionally do in face-to-face learning environments. Thinking about how we can transition that to online learning environments as well. And with the help of online resources and Pinterest and those things that we have at our fingertips on the internet, there are a lot of great examples of icebreakers that we can use in our teaching to still establish those relationships online. Can I have one more person share something that was brought up in their conversation in their breakout room?
So we also talk about the small group possibility, right? It's easier to share with a small group if you don't know them. And also the kind of questions. It needs to be open-ended questions that facilitate the sharing of experience and information amongst each other, and have enough time also to make that happen and then share back. Yeah.
Thank you, Maria. Great examples there. So thinking about small group interactions, right? So we have 20 some people on this call today, but being in a small group of 3 or 4 in a breakout room, conversation becomes more natural. And you can have those more natural conversation and relationship building opportunities. I love the idea of those open-ended questions where you're sharing experiences with one another. So if we as humans are looking for connections with other humans, that's a great opportunity when we're sharing experiences and now having those related shared things that we can relate to with one another. It helps to build those connections and those relationships. So it sounds like you and I, all of you out there and I, are on the same page here, because here are some of my ideas that I would like to share with you. First of all, spend time devoted to community building. So that is important in your online environment in order to start creating and establishing these relationships, both between instructor and students and between peer to peer. Introductions are huge. And as Becky said, icebreakers, that's a great way to begin introducing learners to one another and to you as the instructor. Anytime that you can use somebody's name, that also helps to build a relationship. And so instead of just becoming this blank face on a screen, you are now becoming a person who's engaged in that learning environment. As Maria said, small group interactions, that is a great way to start building those relationships. Even if you are in an online environment where people are not together. So let's say you're in an asynchronous environment where everybody kind of logs on at their own pace and does their work on their own. We can still find ways to use small group interactions and build those relationships. I would say here at Ohio State, the most common one that we use in our online courses are discussion boards, where people can write down their responses or even submit video responses that can be shared with their peers. And whenever their peers log on, they can read or watch those responses with their other peers and have those asynchronous conversations. Something that's going back to Summer's original question when she was thinking about how do you start building these relationships in these situations online where learners literally log on at any time on their own pace and complete these certificate programs or these courses or workshops on their own time. And I, as the instructor, may not be there with them at that same time, and their peers might not be there. We can still use these types of opportunities devoted to building communities and building relationships. Something that I've done in my online courses is I have uploaded an introduction of myself for learners to meet me asynchronously. So sometimes it's like a little bio sheet with some pictures of me and my family. Sometimes it's a short video, 2 minutes long, where they can watch an introduction of me talking to them directly. So I'm not having that real-time introduction, but they still have an opportunity to put a face and a name together. So I become a real person and we start building those relationships. Sometimes it just takes an alternative approach to things that we already do. So I can't introduce myself to you personally and shake your hand, but I can at least still introduce myself by having you read this paper and look at a picture of me waving to you to say hello. So as we wrap up that one, thinking about to engage your learners, they have to have this relationship to feel like they are a valued member of the learning community. If we want them to engage, they have to feel like they belong. And we as the instructors need to find ways to facilitate those relationships and those engagements. Let's move on to fundamental number 2, because these are all going to start being related to each other. We're going to pull this thread that kind of overlaps each fundamental piece as we think about engaging our online learners. The second piece is to create this environment that is conducive to learning. Educators set the tone for the learning environment. And that tone is then carried through that learning experience for your students. I've used some terms already, but let me take a moment to clarify so that we're all on the same page of what different learning environments you could find yourself in online situations. The first is a synchronous learning environment. That is what we're experiencing today. We are live together. We're in different locations around the state, but we are still interacting in real time in the moment together. So we can see each other, we can have conversations with each other. Asynchronous is where the learners are engaging in the environment on their own time. And this is an example like Summer used, where students can log on at any time to complete a certificate program or to complete a workshop or a course. I do not have to be, as the instructor, online at the same time as those learners for them to be able to engage in the learning environment. It is established, they can log on and do it on their own. The last learning environment you may find yourself teaching is a blended. And so this is a combination of those above, the synchronous and the asynchronous pieces, where there are components of your environment where we might see each other face to face, and then components where learners may work on their own time. A blended environment that I like to use when I'm teaching some of my courses here at Ohio State is called a flipped blended environment, where there'll be components where learners are expected to do some things asynchronously on their own, maybe delve into some content, do some exploration, and then bring that information and that knowledge to face-to-face conversations. So I'm facilitating where learners go out, learn some things on their own, and then bring that conversation together and help facilitate real-time conversations. So 3 different learning environments you may find yourself teaching in. To engage learners, we have to recognize that there are barriers to each of those learning environments that may prohibit our learners becoming engaged. And so as educators, having an awareness of these barriers can help us mitigate and get rid of these barriers to the extent possible so that our learners can become engaged in our learning environments. I think I see a chat up there. Summer, do you want to go ahead and ask your question? I see it's pretty long for me to read. Do you mind just hopping on and asking?
Yeah, I was also going to say, I would say that there's a distinction between self-paced and asynchronous, because in a self-paced courses, there might only be one active learner in the course at a time, or there might be several or none at all because the enrollments are on a rolling basis. So I was just going to add to that.
That's a great recognition that we need to be aware of, which can also create extra barriers in our online learning environment, right? So that might be barriers to creating relationships and connections. It might be barriers to interacting with an instructor, because if an instructor kind of puts it up and expects learners to be self-sufficient, there might not be those opportunities. So great awareness. Thanks for clarifying that, Summer. And keep that additional learning environment in mind as we think about these barriers that we'll need to overcome to engage our learners. The first one with that is accessibility. So when we think about engaging our learners, they have to be able to access the learning content if we expect them to be engaged, right? If I can't access something, I can't engage with it. Specifically in Summer's example there, where somebody might log on in a course or a certificate program and they're the only one involved and they're kind of expected to figure things out on their own, organization is important. Right? Our learners have to be able to find what they need in order to engage with the content. So as an educator, thinking about the most logical or simplistic way we can organize things in our online learning environments. Something I often share with our pre-service teachers is that the more steps you have along the way, the more opportunities you have to lose your learners. So if my organization is all kind of disorganized and combobbled and my learners have to search for things, every time they have to go to search for something new, I risk the opportunity of unengaging or losing my learner. Think about this in your own experience. Perhaps there's something posted and you've got to click this link, and then you got to go back and click this link, and then you got to go back and read this document, and then you got to go back and look at this website. And every time there's an additional step, first of all, you might get frustrated, like, oh, I got to go back to this again. It takes additional time. And you risk the opportunity where your learner's like, oh, I've got to get going. I don't have time to finish this, or I'm going to skip this step and just go to this piece. So thinking about organization is key to keep our learners engaged. Simplistic is better. More complicated, you're going to lose your learners. With that, thinking about across Ohio, and we saw that we still see this, we saw it in the pandemic, especially when we had online learning for students, but we're still seeing it. Internet connection and stability. Thinking about that when you're organizing your content. You may have great internet connection and stability wherever you're at or in your extension office, but your learners in their homes and in their communities may not be able to have the same stability or connection and may have trouble accessing things. If I can't access it, I can't engage with it. So thinking about, and that this goes kind of to the next couple points here, the size of the files. So if you have things that your learners have to engage with and they are large files, like a large PowerPoint or a video. If I'm in an area, which I'm in Columbus today for a reason, because my home internet in Southern Fairfield County is very unstable and choppy, I can't download big files with a lot of pictures. And so I have that awareness that when I'm putting content together for my online learners, I have to be aware that not everybody's going to have a strong internet connection, which would limit their accessibility, which limits their engagement. I agree, Margaret. Accessibility is still on and across the county level. I experience it myself every day when I work from home, and my internet is just a notch above dial-up, and we're in 2022. And so I cannot download things like pictures on websites because of my internet connection. And I realize I'm not unique, unfortunately. And there are many of you who experience the same thing. And many of our learners are in these same boats. So thinking about when we put online content up, is it accessible to our learners? If it's not, they can't engage. So that goes with the software needed too. So if I have to download some extra software to be able to access the content, that becomes an additional step, which becomes an extra barrier to be able to engage with the content. Other things that we can think about is password protected resources. So we may have access, maybe through Extension or Ohio State, we may have access to these accounts or these subscriptions where we can easily log on at our work computers and access these resources. But when our learners try to access it, they don't have the same permission or the same level of access to these resources as we do. And so just being aware, if there's an extra step where they have to register an account, that's an extra barrier that's going to prevent them from engaging. So boiling it down, I gave lots of examples in lots of different ways, but accessibility needs to be available or our learners cannot engage. The next barrier we need to think about is digital competency. And I'm going to throw some terms out there, digital natives versus digital immigrants. So when we think about the age and the experiences of our online learners, digital natives are those learners who have grown up with technology. So the millennials and later generations where technology has always been an active part of their life. Digital immigrants are those generations before millennials that haven't always had access to these technologies and resources. One of the mistakes that I found myself making when I started teaching online was that I assumed digital natives were really good at accessing technology and were able to do these amazing things that I just assumed were natural to them. When in reality, they can do some really cool things, but I also realized that some of the basic pieces of using technology were missing from digital natives. So what we need to assume is that we need to devote time and practice to all digital learners, all virtual learners, to practice whatever it is that we need them to do in the online learning environments and provide support and reassurance through that process. Don't assume that they've had prior experience, because that assumption could be wrong. And then if they can't engage with the digital resources, they can't become active learners. It becomes a barrier. So we have to recognize there are different levels of digital competency. Always assume the level was lower to be proactive in making sure that we're inclusive of all learners. One way you can do this, again, is devoting time, just like you are with your relationships, devoting time to allow learners to practice. For example, right when we started this conversation this morning, I was, unbeknownst to you, having you practice using the chat room feature, so that if you've never used a chat response before, now for the rest of our conversation, you are comfortable using it because you've had that experience at the beginning during your introduction. So giving you that little taste of, okay, I can do this. Even if I've never done it before, I'm going to practice it. I am now more likely to be able to use it later on. When I teach courses that extend an entire semester, I devote an entire first week to doing nothing but becoming acquainted with the online learning environment. I have time to do that in a 15-week course. When you're thinking about a 60-minute workshop or some kind of short lesson that is only a half hour, a short time frame, think about the proportionate level and the need of your learners. So if your learners are never expected to do a chat response in that 60 minutes, 30 minutes, you don't necessarily need to practice it. But if you are expecting them to have that capability within your instruction, you do need to devote time for them to have that practice and to be able to support them through it if they've never done it before or if they need some assistance. So just being aware, because again, if we can't access it because of our skills, we can't engage. We as instructors may not have a lot of control over the first two things that we've talked about so far, right? We can't necessarily control the internet connectability and stability of our learners. We may not be able to control their digital competency, but what we can control and help to mitigate when it comes to barriers is communication. Communication is critical when we're trying to engage learners, whether we're synchronous together or whether we're asynchronous and putting things up for learners to engage with on their own. When we think about controlling barriers and helping to mitigate that, one thing specific to online learning is we have to be able to provide tech support information. So let's say that I am teaching an online course and somebody's having trouble accessing the course, they're having trouble accessing some of the resources I'm providing. Being able to share support for your learners so that they can find a way to solve the problem and be able to become engaged. Perhaps this is in an introduction, including a piece of, during this course, if you have trouble accessing the site or accessing the content, here is who you can contact. Here is a link for IT support to help you through this. Specific to online, we have to think about those barriers, and specifically with asynchronous. So we'll go back to Summer's example of, I have this certificate program, I kind of put it up and students do their things and I'm over here doing something else. You're not always accessible for those learners. So providing them the resources on how to gain help when they need it. With that, we also have to think about boundaries and establishing boundaries with our online learners and communication. It is not unusual for my online learners who are college students to want to email me at a time of night that I am normally sleeping, like after midnight between 3 a.m. College students feel like that's a great time to work on asynchronous work. I am not at my computer working at that time to respond immediately to their urgent questions. And it's always the night before something's due, right? So they have this sense of urgency. They want help and they need help right away. Thinking about how we communicate boundaries to our students in online environments to maintain the professionalism and the expectations that you have for them as your learners. For example, I will not be available for these hours. However, if you have issues, here's a number for IT that you can call. As long as they have the ability to help solve their own problem, you're helping to mitigate that online barrier without having to be the immediate access point. If they don't have that information and you're not communicating those pieces, they become frustrated. And that's where some conflicts can arise, right? And so we're trying to mitigate and address these online barriers specific to communication to prevent conflicts and to engage learners. When we're thinking about communication with our online learners, we have to be consistent, whether that is a consistent schedule of how I'm communicating. Am I sending out reminders? Am I sending out email notes? Am I sending out video reminders, text messages, whatever it might be that works for you and your learners? Just make it consistent and predictable. As humans, these complex humans who want social interaction, if we don't have information, we assume the worst. That is true in online learning environments as well. I don't have the information, so she must not care if I do this. I don't have the information. It's not important to her. It's not important to me. Those are some of the assumptions that learners will start making if they don't have the information that's needed to be successful and to engage. Not only does it have to be consistent, however you choose to engage your learners, it has to be clear. The more clarity we can add to our expectations, whether it's synchronous learners or asynchronous learners, the more clarity we can add in those expectations and in our instructions, the less confusion, the more engagement that will happen. This may be instructions for how to navigate the online course. This might be instructions for how to submit assignments. This could be instructions for how to engage with the instructor or your peers. Whatever it could be, or however it is applied to your learning environment, think about the clarity and the level of detail that you provide. One of the major barriers with communicating online that can inhibit or prohibit engagement is thinking about learners not knowing what to do. Making sure we're adding that clarity. Learners in online environments are not always able to ask questions that we as educators would be able to easily answer in a face-to-face and learning environment. In a face-to-face learning environment, a learner might have a simple question that would take 2 minutes for us as educators to answer. In an online learning environment, that might turn into an email exchange of 5 or 6 emails back and forth to answer that one question. So if we can add as much clarity as possible up front, our learners become engaged, less confused, less frustrated, and are more willing and motivated to continue learning. I'm going to give you a moment to stop, and I want you to process through that. And if you have a question about communication or online learning and communication, I want you to take a moment and put that in the chat. So I'll give you a moment to reflect on everything I just threw at you and put your questions in the chat if you have one. All right, I'm not seeing chats pop up. I'm not seeing hands raised. So we're going to continue forward and look at fundamental number 3, which is active learning. Active learning is something that research literature tells us engages learners. So if I can create an active learner who is actively thinking or actively doing something, they are more engaged in the learning process than being passive. So let's talk about these active learning and strategies, because it becomes more complicated in an online learning environment. With agricultural education and extension education, we preach hands-on learning, right? Learning to do, doing to learn. That is our motto. So how do we take the online aspect, or not, the hands-on aspect, and put that in a virtual environment? And one of the assumptions of active learning is that it has to be hands-on. That is not the assumption. Active is also minds-on. So hands-on or minds-on. Some strategies that we can take, again, that are often seen in face-to-face learning environments that we can transition to online learning environments are thinking about, first of all, opening your session or opening your instruction in an engaging way. Going back to the educator is setting the tone for the environment. Opening those first few minutes will set the tone for the rest of the environment and the rest of the instruction. Even in an asynchronous situation, we can still think of ways to engage our learners the moment they log on and look at the content. When I teach my asynchronous classes, I always have what I call an attention getter. It's the first thing that students will do within that lesson or within that weekly content to really grab their attention or get them excited about what is coming the rest of that lesson. It becomes more challenging in an online environment to be creative in this way, but videos are a great opportunity, making sure short and sweet. Don't make a 30-minute video to engage somebody because that's going to disengage them, but a short, sweet video can engage them. I like to use memes in my asynchronous. I will find some funny memes or some interesting memes online that I think are relevant to the content. I will pose thinking questions, or I'll give a scenario of this happened. Let's talk about that. However you can find to engage learners, those first few moments that they are engaged in your learning environment will set the tone and already create this active learning process where they are minds on. Other active learning strategies, thinking about keeping content simplified and slowed down. Oftentimes we realize that we're on a time crunch. I've got 60 minutes. I've got to tell them everything they need to know about this topic. I am taking a 15-week course that I teach on learner engagement, and I'm shoving it down to 60 minutes. So I have to pick and choose what I feel is the most critical pieces for you to walk away with. Interactivity. So if possible, thinking about how you can engage your learners in interactivity. This could be a breakout room. This could be asking students by name to share an experience or to share their insight or opinion on something. Having students become interactive with the learning environment. All educators, all of you out there are educators, you realize that flexibility is key, right? Rarely does anything go as planned in the moment. We need to recognize that as online educators as well. We have to be flexible with our learners. Again, if they have barriers to engage, like accessibility, we have to be flexible with those learners. Perhaps it's our instruction. Maybe we have to realize the flexibility of, I'm not going to be able to give them everything I thought I was within this time frame. How can I adapt and modify in the moment? The last principle I threw up here is called the 10-2 principle. When we think about teaching, there's a rule of thumb that the attention span of your learners is about correlated with their age, up until about age 20. So if you are teaching 10-year-olds, their attention span is about 10 minutes. If you're teaching 15-year-olds, it's about 15 minutes. When we get to adults, it's about 20 minutes consistently until we start getting to about 60, 70, and it actually starts decreasing a little bit. Recognizing our attention span as a fixed amount of time, as educators, how can we change pace or do something different within that time frame to keep learners engaged and active? If we don't recognize the attention span runs out, learners become disengaged and start thinking about focusing on doing other things. Online, the rule of thumb is very similar to that correlated age and attention span. It's about 10 to 2. What that means is for about 10 minutes, you can engage and lecture and speak to your learners. But then you need to pause for a minute or two and let them process or do something different to break up the time. Without doing that, again, you risk the opportunity of disengaging your learners. And when you disengage your learners, learning stops or doesn't happen at the efficiency that we hoped it would. At this moment, I'm going to practice what I'm preaching here. And I want you to go back into your small groups. And I know we're running short on time, so I'm going to give you 2 minutes here to brainstorm some ways that you have experienced or that you can think of to deliver online instruction in an engaging way. So 2 minutes, how can you brainstorm engaging ways to deliver online instruction? So Jared, I'm just going to give them 2 minutes on this, and then we'll return back and share some of your ideas.
A quick one, see you in 2 minutes.
Jared, do you notice that people leave when we go to breakout rooms?
Yeah, there's always a little bit of a bleed off, especially so like this one, I think was there 1 or 2 people that left. This was probably they have a 10 o'clock meeting and they thought rather than get into a breakout room, they're just going to split. But yeah, we lost, I think 5 or 6 at the first breakout. And that is common. I mean, every session that I've seen.
Because we're experiencing that with the Wonder Woman series that I do.
Mm-hmm.
I think people just think that they're gonna just listen in.
Yeah.
And it's funny because some people either love it or they hate it.
Yeah.
Ground. So
Yeah.
I was just curious to see if you're seeing that too.
Oh yeah, for sure. I mean, the only ones I don't see it are like those mandatory type programs where they know that they have to stay. Yeah, it's been something I've thought about too, because it's I don't know, for me as somebody who likes to learn, I'm like, why would you come and not engage? And I mean, I'm an introvert, so I don't love like being thrown in a room with strangers, but like I'm here to learn. I know it's engaging. I know it's a good way to do it. So I don't know. I guess in my head, I tell myself, well, it just weeds out the people that aren't as serious about learning, right? If they really wanted to learn, they'd stay.
That's a good way of looking at it. Thank you.
It's tough though. Yeah. I mean, you see it and you're like, yeah. All right. All right. I think we got everybody back.
Great. Good to see you all back. I popped in and heard a few suggestions in a couple of the breakout rooms. Can I have 2 volunteers who can share one of the ideas that came up on how we can engage learners in interactive learning online? What were some of the ideas that popped up in your conversation? 2 examples would be great.
In our group, Peggy mentioned about incorporating physical activity into I thought that was pretty good. I like to, most of the time when I'm on the Zoom, I'm usually up walking or something like that. So for me, that sounded very good to incorporate into, as long as your participants are able to do so, but that sounded good. Mm-hmm.
Great example. Thanks, Don. I know when my sons were doing virtual learning as 2nd grader last year, the teacher actually played a 2 or 3 minute yoga video sometimes, or a dance video, to get the students physically moving for a moment and take a break from online instruction. It was a great opportunity for those little 2-year-olds to get the wiggles out. And I loved that idea. It's a great suggestion, Don. Who can have one more example of how we engage learners online?
Trying to help them
I see
see
you talking.
why,
Oops. Go ahead. Somebody else. I saw somebody else's mouth move. Go ahead.
trying to help them see why this is important to them. Make a connection with, if you're trying to save money at the grocery store, this is one way that you could do it. And, help them see the reality of what you're doing.
Great example. So making it relevant and applicable to them. So if you can relate it, and that comes back from the relationships, right? So if you know your audience and know about them, you can make those content connections to make it real life and applicable to them. Now I'm interested and engaged because it directly impacts me. Great examples. Thank you for that. In our time, I know we're running short, so I've got one last fundamental I want to share with you, and thankfully it's the shortest one. It's providing clear and timely feedback to your learners. Just as in our face-to-face, learners want to know, am I doing this right? Am I getting it? And we in the online environment as educators have to realize that need is still there within our learners. Again, we are these humans, we have these complex wants, needs. We need to know that we're on the right track because that motivates us to continue learning. It motivates us to apply this to our lives. And it creates that interest to keep us engaged. The challenge with online learning becomes how timely and specific that feedback can be. It is hard to see body language. It's hard to see faces. It is hard to read those cues that we get when we're face to face, when there's a computer screen between us. And so just being proactive and giving some timely feedback in a manner that our students are feeling like it's consistent and it's at the timely of when I need it to continue moving forward. So if it's in a synchronous environment, thinking about every once in a while giving some verbal affirmation or taking a moment and asking questions and getting some feedback and saying, yes, you're understanding this, let's move forward. Or no, let's take a moment and revisit that. Feedback is important, but becomes a challenge in the online environment, but is still critical to keeping learners engaged. It creates that motivation. It creates that interest to continue learning. If we reviewed everything we've talked about in the last 60 minutes, there are 4 fundamentals that make teaching good teaching no matter the environment that you find yourself in. These are fundamentals that can be transferred from online to in-person to hybrid modes of giving instruction. Those 4 fundamentals: establishing relationships, critical, one of the most impactful factors for engaging learners. Creating that environment conducive to learning. So the educator sets the tone. So what is that tone that you're setting that wants your learners to become engaged? Using active learning. So you can use breakout rooms, you can use hands-on activities, however you can bring active learning. Active learning is both hands-on and minds-on of your learners. Lastly, continuing to provide feedback to your learners and their progress. Are they on the right track? Are they getting it? Or how can you help assist and support them to get where they need to be? Fundamentals of good teaching, no matter the environment you find yourself in. As we wrap up in our final moments together, in the chat box, I want you to respond with one example of how you can apply some of this information to your online learning environment. So each of you are teaching in a different type of online learning environment. How can you apply some of this information to your specific learning environment? So take a last moment and put your response in the chat for me.
As you're writing, I'll take a moment just to say thank you very much, Dr. Filson. We appreciate your time and energy put into today's lesson for us. So we appreciate your preparation and being with us this morning. Thank you.
Thank you, Jared. And thank you all for finding time on your calendars this morning. I know calendar space is prime real estate. And so I appreciate you taking an hour this morning to join us. So looking at your responses, some are planning to use some automatic feedback and quizzes. Great example of timely and specific. Margaret's going to use the 10-2 rule, using names more. Becky also using names and coming up with creative ways to engage participants. As the final responses are coming into the chat, I will thank you all again for joining us. If you have any questions or would like to engage in conversation, you can always contact me at my email address there. And thank you all for your engagement this morning.
Yes, thank you all. Thanks again, Dr. Filson. I did post a link to an evaluation in the chat box, as well as the link to our landing page. April 14 is our next session on data visualization. So check that out and get registered at our landing page. But thank you all for your time and have a great Thursday.
Thank you, everybody. And thank you, Caryn.
Thanks.